Welcome to video number 5. This will serve as a preview to lecture 5, which will happen on Monday, January 11th. And the topic here is endocrine disorders. This is the last lecture for chapter 17 and is actually a good way to end the chapter because we will be looking at the cases where we have either too much or too little of a hormone. What this does is it allows us to understand the physiology of each hormone a little bit better by seeing what goes wrong when we have either hypo or hyper secretion. So let's take a look at the outline. I have at the top here Roman numeral 2. This really should be Roman numeral 1, but these were from an older presentation where this was the second topic. So the topic here is Roman numeral 1, endocrine disorders. We'll take a look at one gland at a time. However, we'll start with just general hyposecretion and hypersecretion, and then we'll get into the pituitary and then the subsequent glands after that. Let's begin with the concepts of hyposecretion and hypersecretion. This is the first section, or the first subsection of this part of the text. Hyposecretion is too little of a hormone, and so not enough is being secreted. The example given in your text is diabetes insipidus. This would be a hyposecretion of ADH, antidiuretic hormone, which we know, of course, comes from the posterior pituitary. In this case, the lack of hormone allows too much sodium to be released by the kidneys into our urine, and because of that, water will follow the sodium by osmosis, and so you get a large volume of urine produced, and this is called diabetes insipidus. Hypersecretion is too much of a hormone, so we have too much secretion from the endocrine gland. The example given in one of the examples is Graves' disease, also called toxic goiter. This is an autoimmune disease, and we'll talk about this when we get to the thyroid gland. For our rundown of the disorders based on their location, we'll begin with the pituitary disorders. The first two on the list are acromegaly and gigantism. These are both due to an increase or too much growth hormone. Acromegaly occurs in adulthood after the closure of our epiphyseal plates, whereas gigantism occurs during childhood, and we can see sort of the difference in this if we think about it, right? If you have lots of growth hormone stimulating the division of those cartilage cells in the epiphyseal plates during childhood, we're going to get people who have a high rate of growth. They're going to be very tall. And so generally the people you see that are extremely tall, like above 7 feet, 7.5 feet, 8 feet tall, often the result of hypersecretion of growth hormone. Acromegaly in adulthood, we stop growing in height, but we can still grow in width of our bones. And so what we can see is a increase in the size. There's an example in this figure of the person's very large hand. And then in the next figure, we can see a woman throughout the phase of her life as she ages, and you can see looks like a normal child, even up through a teenager, and then some of her facial features get really large. So that's kind of a classic acromegaly. Another example you might know about is the professional wrestler and sometime actor who is Andre the Giant. He was in the very large character in Princess Bride. We'll return to the outline and cover pituitary dwarfism. This is a hyposecretion of growth hormone during childhood. And so in this case, as the children are growing with low growth hormone concentration, they'll end up being very small. So small bones, very short in stature, and also very petite, just small all the way around. Of course, this is easily treated now by just simply administering growth hormone. The last one on this list is diabetes insipidus, and this is hyposecretion of ADH. And I just mentioned that one when we talked about hyposecretion. And so again, this would cause diabetes insipidus. So that covers the pituitary disorders. Next, let's move to the thyroid and parathyroid. The first two disorders on this list are congenital hypothyroidism and myxedema. These are both due to a decrease or a hyposecretion of thyroid hormone. Congenital hypothyroidism occurs from birth, and myxedema would be in adults. And myxedema would be a prolonged hyposecretion of thyroid hormone. In congenital hypothyroidism, we would see stunted physical development as well as mental development. Generally low metabolic rate, people will be lethargic and sluggish. This also tells us about the importance of thyroid hormone in development, because these people are generally severely mentally retarded because of the lack of development of the nervous system. Myxedema, on the other hand, this would occur in adults, and so if you have low thyroid hormone, you can sort of guess what would happen here, since thyroid hormone sets the metabolic rate. So these people would have a low metabolic rate, probably feel cold, they would have weight gain, they would feel sluggish, very low energy, and so it would sort of manifest itself in those ways. The next one, number 3 on the list, endemic goiter. This is low thyroid hormone due to a lack of iodine. And if you remember back to the lecture where we talked about the formation of thyroid hormone, we had the iodine being secreted into the follicles, the making of the thyroglobulin, and then you had the T3 or the T4 based on whether it had 3 iodines or 4 iodines, right? So if we have a lack of iodine in the diet, then of course the thyroid gland cannot make thyroid hormone, and so then we'll have a lack of thyroid hormone. This will be characterized by, of course, a high TSH level, high thyroid stimulating hormone, because without thyroid hormone we would have no negative feedback to the hypothalamus and pituitary, and then the pituitary would be continue to secrete thyroid stimulating hormone in an effort to induce the thyroid gland to keep producing thyroid hormone. Of course, the result of that would be the thyroid hormone starts to produce more and more thyroglobulin, the follicles get bigger and bigger, and you end up with what's called a goiter, which is the enlargement of the thyroid gland. You can see these 2 pictures here. Both of these look like their necks are swollen, and that is the evidence of endemic goiter. This is very rare now in advanced countries because we figured out that it was iodine that was lacking in the diet, and so we have made our salt that you can buy in the grocery store iodized, and so anytime you will have anything with salt in it, which in the American diet is quite often, we're getting plenty of iodine now. There are still some parts of the world that are generally far from the coasts, that have still you might see endemic goiter. But if you live anywhere near the coastline, you probably are eating some seafood and getting lots of iodine from those foods. Our 4th disorder for the thyroid gland is Graves' disease. This is a hypersecretion, so too much of thyroid hormone, and this is an autoimmune disease. I know a little bit about this one because my younger daughter has Graves' disease. So this is when the body forms antibodies, and it's probably against some infection that came along the way somehow, and the antibodies end up being very similar in size and shape to thyroid-stimulating hormone, and so they activate the TSH receptors on the thyroid gland, and the thyroid gland just starts cranking out thyroid hormone. So this happened a couple years ago with my daughter, and she was complaining about headaches, and she was hot all the time, and her hands were sweaty, and she had a high heart rate. And I said, it's probably just the diet. You need to drink more water. And I didn't think much of it. And then sure enough, we went to the doctor and said, that sounds like a thyroid issue. And I said, oh, boy, it sure does. And so now she's on medication just to reduce the thyroid gland's synthesis of thyroid hormone. The last 2 disorders here are of the parathyroid. So hypoparathyroidism would be a low concentration of PTH, parathyroid hormone. This would cause muscle spasms, and it would cause an extra excitation of the nervous system, and therefore muscle contractions as well. And the reason for this is because, of course, parathyroid hormone is involved in calcium homeostasis. And so with hypoparathyroidism, we could develop a low calcium concentration in the blood, And since calcium is a positive ion, that would be less positive ions on the outside of our membranes, and that actually reduces membrane potential, and so these cells in general now are more excitable. That would be neurons and muscle fibers. Hyperparathyroidism, or too much PTH, does the opposite. We would have a high calcium level in the blood, but remember, parathyroid hormone would activate the osteoclasts in the bones, and so we would be dissolving bones, so we could end up with soft bones. And because you'd have a high calcium in the blood, you risk kidney stones, and you would also have a sort of sluggish nervous system. You would have a deactivation, and so your reflexes might seem slow, or might seem less like it takes lots of great effort to activate, say, muscle contractions. So that covers thyroid and parathyroid. Next, let's look at the adrenal gland. The two disorders here are Cushing's syndrome and androgenital syndrome. So let's start with Cushing's syndrome. This is excess cortisol, or too much cortisol release from the adrenal cortex. This could be due to too much stimulation of the cortex by high levels of ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone from the anterior pituitary. Or it could just simply be too much cortisol by the adrenal cortex itself. Another reason you might have this condition is taking too much cortisol medication, so hydrocortisone, or some of these steroids for either as a painkiller or to reduce inflammation. And so this would happen if you took long-term cortisol medications. The symptoms of Cushing's syndrome are fat deposits in the shoulders and in the face, and generally you have a high blood glucose level, because what cortisol does is it increases the fuels that are available for muscles to use, and so you'll have increase in blood glucose, increase in blood lipids, also breaking down of proteins to help provide energy for the tissues to use. And so we'll just go through some of these figures. Here is an infant, 6-month-old, with Cushing's syndrome, and you can see the face looks really puffy because of lots of fat deposits. Here's a picture of a boy on the left in his normal condition, and in the right, it's the same boy with Cushing's syndrome. And you can see how the fat deposits in his face just make it look very bloated. And the last one, there's a classic example of what's called the buffalo hump, where you can see the arrow on the right, where you have fat deposit right between the shoulders at the base of the neck. And you can also see that her face also looks a little puffy as well compared to the picture on the left. And finally, here's the photo from your textbook of Cushing's syndrome, and you can see she has what seems to be a very swollen face, often called the moon face. So that covers Cushing's syndrome. The next is androgenital syndrome, and this is a hypersecretion of adrenal androgens. So these are androgens coming from the adrenal cortex, and so the main secretion here is DHEA, but also could be testosterone or other derivatives of testosterone. So these have a masculinizing effect, and so we can see from the pictures here that what generally happens is that these are actually females, biological females, whose genitalia now, of course, have enlarged, so the clitoris looks like a penis. And so when they are born, they're often mistaken for boys because of the high levels of androgens. Finally, we'll get to our last two sections. The first one being diabetes mellitus. Essentially, you might call this a pancreatic disease, although when we get to type 2, you'll see it's not just the pancreas that's affected. And then we'll see the last section, which is a sort of a neat add-on to the end of your chapter on the deeper insight section, 17.4. Take a look at that, because it's about the discovery of insulin, which is a truly interesting and unique story. But let's start with diabetes mellitus a little bit. I won't go into all the detail that's on this slide. We'll save that for the lecture on Monday. But we'll just start with the types. Type 1 before I do that, let me back up a bit and just say diabetes mellitus is generally a metabolic disruption of carbohydrate, fat, and protein metabolism, and it results from either the hyposecretion of insulin from the pancreas, from the beta cells, right? Or it's when our tissues don't respond to the insulin that is being secreted. And the difference there is type 1 versus type 2. So type 1 is when there is no insulin secretion. This is often has often been referred to as the child onset diabetes because it typically occurs in children. This is an autoimmune disorder where antibodies are somehow made and then attack the beta cells of the pancreas. Those beta cells are destroyed, and so the pancreas can no longer produce insulin. So this is also called insulin-dependent diabetes mellitus. So these people have to take insulin shots daily, and especially after every meal, monitor their blood glucose levels. This has gotten better over the years as we've been able to do insulin pumps and have a better control over blood glucose levels. Type 1 represents about 5 to 10% of all cases of diabetes. The main one is type 2, and this is more of a metabolic disorder that relates to our tissues, mostly muscle, skeletal muscle, and also adipose tissue that don't respond to insulin that is being released. And so type 2 is referred to as insulin resistance. So insulin will typically signal these cells to take up glucose out of the blood, and therefore the blood glucose levels drop. But these tissues are now resistant to insulin, and so insulin stays in the blood, giving a chronically high blood glucose level that then has physiological consequences down the road. Lots of diseases, blindness, nerve damage, high risk of heart disease, and then impaired wound healing, and especially the risk of amputation of the feet and lower legs. Okay, I'll leave it at that, and we'll talk about the pathogenesis and some more details about diabetes in Monday, as well as the discovery of insulin. I'll see you in class.